Hi, everyone. This is Scott Nybakken for Dynamite Comics. I'm here with James LaRossa Jr. and Jonathan Vankin, authors of the graphic novel adaptation, The Last of the Gladiators. Jimmy's fascinating memoir about his relationship with his father, the legendary defense attorney, Jimmy LaRossa. Welcome to the channel, both of you.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Scott. It's exciting to talk about this book.
Yep. Great to be here.
Jim, you're joining us today right after an oral surgery appointment. Because folks are wondering about your missing tooth there.
Yes. Yeah. I've showed up. I've showed up with a front tooth out, and it's kind of a funny story that I go over within the book. When I was 16, I was taught how to drive by one of my father's drivers, a guy by the name of Frank Beauvais, who was a great driver. So he taught me the ropes, and I've always been a pretty good wheelman, except one time when I was coming home from caddying 2 loops. I had stopped at McDonald's. McDonald's in those days was fairly new. And I had some French fries in the front seat, and they fell into the well of the car. And while I was down there retrieving them, I had crossed over the road, and I hit a huge stone marker of an estate, lost my front teeth. By the time I got to the hospital, there was an oral surgeon there tending to me, and somebody had gotten to my father on the golf course. And sure enough, I hear in the distance these cleats coming hard and fast, and I knew they had to be him. He comes in and he sees that, basically I'm all right. I was going to live to torture him another day. Gives me a big noogie on the head, calls me an asshole, and walks out. And that was my father. He was a doozy, man.
Now this is a good segue to go into the history of your father. Can you give us like a capsule of his career and how he rose to prominence in the New York City's legal world?
Sure. Well, he was involved in Tammany Hall, which was a big Democratic political group that was filled with Irish and Italian Americans. And through that, he got to know Robert Kennedy. And one day, he was assigned to accompany the president and his brother. And John had trouble getting up on the car and slipped. My father grabbed him by the arm, and the Secret Service ordered him to take his hand off the president, which he did very quickly. And he must have said something that made them both laugh. And Robert kind of remembered this big-eared, smart-ass attorney from New York. And so he wound up in the Kennedy Justice Department, which was a really great place to land. And he really cut his teeth there. People asked him where he went to law school. He went to Fordham Law School. But oftentimes he said, my law school was the Kennedy administration Justice Department. One day, he'd never talked to Robert, of course, but one day Robert did personally call him. The era of skyjackings was going heavy in the early 60s. And there was a very decorated soldier who got drunk, wound up peeing on one of the carts, assaulting a co-pilot that went back there, and he was arrested. So Robert said, Robert wanted my father to throw the book at him, basically, and send him to jail for a long time. And my father, a Korean War veteran who really admired those guys who came from World War II, pled with Attorney General Kennedy to let him look into it, that there must be extenuating circumstances. Kennedy said, "That's why I called you," and hung up. So he did what was ordered of him, and he was very upset by it. And that was around the time where he decided he wasn't going to be a prosecutor. So he went to the defense bar, and right off the bat, he was hired by Daniel Motto, who was the head of the Bakers Union, who was in big trouble in federal court. And Dad took it on, and his defensive motto was really noticed by other lawyers. And from there, he just became the go-to lawyer in New York. There was a succession of colorful criminals, politicians, pornographers, as well as, racketeering, civil rights leaders. And amongst those clients, he defended all 5 of the New York crime families. And they're the Gambinos, the Colombos, the Lucchese's, the Genovese, and the Bananos. And in fact, in the book, I have a diagram of most of his clients abridged, and you can see what that was like. A little bit of research just turned up a plethora of things. He also became very well known. In 1970, he tried a case before the United States Supreme Court, which is still quoted today quite regularly. It was called Giglio versus the United States. And he won it, a unanimous decision. It was about prosecutorial misconduct. And from there, he just went on and on and on. And, my father and I were a peas in a pod. So I really learned firsthand what he was doing. And it was a time when he was in the metro section of every single paper, literally every week. So it was a fascinating time to see him accelerate his career. And, he was a moving target. On any given day, he was in a variety of courtrooms. And then, of course, the last 5 years of his life, we went over everything very carefully. And thus, I was able to translate that into the book. So that's how we started, basically.
Yeah, and this was like the book was you originally published it as a prose title back in 2019 with the subtitle "A Memoir of Love, Redemption, and the Mob." So it's got a lot of great colorful history and of father's cases and things, but it also has a great story of your relationship with him, as especially at the end of his life when you were taking care of him out here in California.
Mm-hmm.
So growing up with such a larger than life personality for a father, this must have put a lot of unique pressures on you and your siblings. How did you react to those when you began to find your own way in the world?
It was an adventure. My sisters are much younger than I am, but my brother's only 14 months difference. But my father and I had such a close relationship. It did create some pressure. Of course, in school, everybody thought thought my family were mafioso instead of a very ethical lawyer who just defended some mobsters, because he was in the papers all the time. And even Connecticut kids found out about it through their parents. I can tell you this, there was a time, and I learned this from him at the end. There was a time when he had a table at Rayo's every other Wednesday night that he had gotten for Joe Watts after an acquittal. Dad charged him his fee, and he said, "I also want your Wednesday table at Rayo's." So he had a table at Rayo's every other week. He walked in one day, and there were these Albanian mobsters who were at his table. And they were pretty tough guys. And frankly, the guys that ran the restaurant were too afraid to throw them out of the restaurant. So he just says, fuck it. And he just leaves. And a week later, these guys have the nerve to march into his office to seek defense. Well, he blows them off, and they come back, and he blows them off. And these guys got upset, and they were stupid enough to threaten him and threaten his family. One day, when they were in a club in Queens, they were apprehended, thrown down a flight of stairs, tied up in a basement. And, it came very close. They came very close to getting blowtorched. And I think those guys wound up getting the message. Now, let me get back to your original question. During that time, I went to school with a armed guard. My brother and I went to school, and we didn't know what the hell was going on. So there were lots and lots of incidents like that, that kind of showed me firsthand that my father was involved in some, really, really controversial stuff. And it affected me more than anything because I was the one that spent the most time with my father. And it was a unique upbringing, without a doubt. He was the proverbial accident that you can't turn away from. He was just an amazing guy, and we did go through a lot. But looking back on it, it's all fun and games.
Bring Jonathan in. John, can you tell us about how the graphic novel adaptation for this came about? How did you get involved with that?
Well, I got involved with it really because the editor, Matt Idelson, who I knew from working at DC Comics when I used to work at Vertigo, and Matt was in the DC universe as an editor, and I was an editor. He just called me up, and I hadn't heard from him in quite a while, and he just called me up and pitched me this idea. It said that they had the rights to this book, and had I read it, I hadn't read it at the time, so I immediately bought it and on my Kindle and read it right away and loved it, obviously, and said, yeah, I'm in, of course. For me, it was great because, when I was at Vertigo, we were always looking for interesting stuff. And one of the things that always fascinated me was I was always looking for somebody who could write some sort of story. I didn't really care what, but something that was set in New York in the 1970s and early 80s, because I'm just so fascinated by that period. I didn't grow up there or anything, but I went to NYU briefly during that period, and more like the early 80s. And, it was just such a interesting place, not an easy place to live, but fascinating. And I always wanted someone to do something, to do a comic or a graphic novel about that. And I never found anybody, but somehow this one just fell into my lap. So I wrote it myself based on this amazing book that Jimmy Jr. here has written. And I was just so happy to have done it for that and so many other reasons. So that's really how it came about. It was more like Matt, thought of me. So it was just, I don't know, just one of those things.
When you were in New York, did you remember the assassination of Paul Castellano in front of Sparks Steakhouse?
Yeah, that was actually after I had been in New York, though. I would go back there every now and then. I was there. I'm dating myself here, which my wife is going to be really mad at me for doing.
Oh my!
But I was there when John Lennon was shot, and
wow.
So that was the big trauma for me. That was just awful.
Sure.
Really awful for me. But yeah, the Castellano thing was a few years later. So I obviously remembered when it happened. I wasn't in New York at the time, but yeah, it was huge news, as you know. And as always, another reason I was so excited about doing this book, one of the many other reasons, was that I've always been really fascinated by mafia lore and history, organized crime. When I was a little kid, my dad took me to see The Godfather, probably well before he should have, but he did, and I loved it. And and all those other movies that in the subsequent years. And I've read so many books, and all, in addition to novels like The Godfather, a lot of the true accounts of mafia history. So I was just fascinated, and I really wanted to write something about that. And again, this just sort of came into my lap, which was great. So when the Castellano thing happened, I of course read about it and kind of knew exactly what was going on because I had read so much about the mafia. I had the background to know, like, oh man, this is going to be something. This is a big deal that this guy got gunned down in this fashion.
On the day Castellano was assassinated, he was on trial. My father was defending him, and he came to my father's office, gave Christmas presents to the secretaries, and huddled with my father My father, they were winning the trial without a doubt. If you look at the titles of the Daily News and the New York Times, it was obvious that they were winning the trial. So he invited my father to Sparks to eat dinner with him. Of course, Jimmy had to prepare for trial the next day, turned him down. They went to Sparks, and they were gunned down out front. But Scott, you asked me before, how the family felt about all this. I was 26 years old at the time. I was living in Rome. I was watching the news when the news was preempted with the assassination, with the killing. And they went right to Sparks, and I kind of came unglued. I thought there was a series of limos, including the one that Castellano had stepped out of when he was shot. And I thought I saw my father's car there.
Oh, yeah, no.
So I recount this in detail in the book, but that was something that threw us all, because the question was, would my father have been gunned down if he was in that car? So that was just one of the many things my family endured during those days.
Yeah, I can't imagine how scary that must have been. I mean, obviously, John Gotti's gunmen were not going to discriminate between whoever was in that car. So that just really, boy, I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
But I did try to imagine, because that incident is depicted in the book, as are most of the other things that you just talked about. So you can see all those things. Graphic novel form.
Right on.
Yeah. And speaking of which, how did you connect with Giorgio Pontrelli, the artist for the book? And
well, that was Matt also. I mean, he's just good at what he does. And we went through, I mean, he ran most of the artists that he had proposed by me. And, there were some who weren't available, who were, so many who were really good. But Giorgio was great. And he was as great as anybody that Matt had shown me. It just happened to be sort of running down the list, came to his name. And, he's done a lot of things. He's done, I think he's probably most known for this Italian comic series called Dylan Dog that a lot of Italian comic book artists have worked on, and he's worked on that. He's done some James Bond stuff for Dynamite also. So he'd worked for Dynamite before. He's just a really, really good artist, and he's based over there in Rome. And I really felt like, I was really enthusiastic when Matt showed me his work, because I really felt like he had that kind of grit, he like his pencil and ink work just had that sort of edge to it that I really thought this story should have, given where it was set and what it was about. This wasn't like a pretty story that should be depicted, with beautiful artwork. I mean, his artwork is beautiful, but in a different way. And it's very gritty, and he captures the whole sort of darkness of of the scene there in New York at that time. And I should also mention, since we're talking about him, it's like the rest of the team was also fantastic. Obviously, starting with Jimmy here, I mean, just the material we had to work with was just, how could you go wrong? Really, I hope how could you go wrong? Hopefully I don't think I did, but it's just such great material. It was easy to work with. But then we had Giorgio, we had Matt Idelson, a fantastic editor, and we had Giuseppe Pica, the colorist, who is a studio mate of Giorgio's over there in Rome, who I think just did an amazing job with the colors. I mean, it just makes the artwork, Giorgio's artwork, just jump off the page and just sort of draws you into the reality of it. So I thought his colors were terrific. And then finally, Pat Brosseau, who you probably remember from DC also.
I know Pat well from our time.
Yeah. Pat worked when I was at Vertigo. I worked with Pat, who's the letterer. He did the lettering on the book. So I worked with him on a number of projects at Vertigo, including the Harvey Picard stuff, the Quitter and American Splendor at Vertigo. So great letterer, one of the best in the business. So we were just really, really glad to get him too. So yeah, we just had a phenomenal team on this book, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of it.
And Jimmy, what drew you to the idea of adapting the story into a graphic novel? Were you a fan of comics, or a regular reader of comics at all?
I really didn't know a lot about graphic novels, but I've become a big fan. I mean, how could you not? They had their own section in Barnes and Nobles. And of course, Dynamite is involved with Red Sonja and The Boys, two of the most interesting graphic novels I've ever read. So I really got well versed in the medium, and I'm a big fan now. I really, really am. And I'm really honored that Dynamite took this project on and took my book on. And I love what Jonathan did. I loved what Giorgio did. And of course, Matt Idelson is the glue that held it all together. So I'm really flattered to be involved in this. And, you know, you got to thank Nick as well,
Definitely.
who's the main man, who really, more than anybody, recruited me. So I'm a big fan now.
Yeah, definitely need to thank Nick. He's the guy. He's the guy at Dynamite.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's all his vision. I mean, he's really an incredible entrepreneur and of comics, and what he's been able to do with Dynamite is really phenomenal. So hard business to survive in the comic book industry. It's definitely not easy. And the fact that he's been able to make a go of it the way he has with Dynamite and be so successful is really credit to him.
Yeah. And finally, to wrap things up, like the story like this is a big sprawling life story of Jimmy LaRossa, but the heart of it is really Jimmy Jr.'s relationship with his father. And so with that in mind, like, what's the one overriding message you'd like readers to come away with when they finish the book?
Well, I was my father's namesake. And as I said before, we were very, very, very close. And I was kind of a rebellious kid. My father was really good at reining me in. And Last of the Gladiators is a love story along with everything else. Taking care of my father those last 5 years really redeemed me in my own eyes and redeemed my life. It was a wonderful, wonderful period. I cooked him the best Italian food I could, and we talked. And he was in a wheelchair and on oxygen, but we made it to Tuscany twice. We made it to Vietnam. We had just an absolute blast. My father was my main man. He really, really was. I loved him dearly. So more than anything, it's a love story between a father and a son. And I was glad to be able to really write about it because my father was so sick those last 5 years. I had forgotten the man in his prime, the man that could lift me off the floor and squeeze the guts out of me. I forgot about that man. And writing the book really brought me back to those times. So, I guess the main message is love conquers all. That's really it in a nutshell.
An excellent message to go out on. So, Jimmy and John, thank you both for joining us. The Last of the Gladiators will be in stores in October, so be sure to pre-order it now, and be sure to follow Dynamite Comics on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X to hear more about all of our upcoming releases. And thanks everyone for watching.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks,
Jonathan.
Scott.
Thank you.
And thank you, Jimmy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, brother.